On this week's episode, we're going to duck out and let the robots do the work. Let's see if you notice. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Anxiety Monkeys, the podcast. I'm your host, Rob, and joining me here in the studio is my co-host, Michelle.
Good morning, everyone.
So we're going to kick this episode off with what I'm calling the litany of apologies. First and foremost, you may notice some extra noise here in the studio this morning, and I do have to apologize about that. We've got the heater running because it's like 7 degrees outside, and we've also got a 3D printer kind of going in the background because I started one of my most ambitious 3D printing jobs about 2 days ago, and I still have about a day's worth of printing left on this one print alone. Printing a couple of bookends for a friend of mine, so that's going to be kind of chugging along in the background, and again, I apologize for that.
I want to give a shout out to Cecil and also to Michelle. We miss you very much.
Yep, and thanks again for placing an order with us. The other thing I've got to apologize about is we've missed a couple of episodes. A couple of weeks ago, I didn't record because my voice was just shot. It sounded like I'd been gargling with gravel again. And
also we had a bit of an emergency. One of our ferrets suffered from an insulomic attack, and we were afraid that we were going to lose her, so we figured it was best that we spend the time with her and keep an eye on her.
Yeah, we got as far as, we were taking her to the vet, to ease her passing. And we got as far as the garage door when she decided, nope, I'm not quite done seeing how things play out. So, she recovered and everything, but yeah, we basically decided to spend the day just kind of keeping an eye on her and monitoring her condition. So yeah, we've missed a couple of episodes, but hey, we're back. So this week we're going to kind of start off by talking about universal basic income. So a couple of things that came out of the last election cycle is people praising Bernie Sanders and Andrew Yang for putting Medicare for all and universal basic income on the map. Now, as far as it goes, I don't know how much good that's actually going to accomplish. There've been a lot of people who've been talking about universal health care or single-payer health care or Medicare for all or whatever you want to call it for quite some time in this country. I will admit that Bernie did bring some focus to the issue and maybe get more people thinking about it and considering it. But if it's on the menu and nobody actually does anything to make it happen, what good does that actually accomplish? The same could be said for Andrew Yang. One of the things that he was pushing for was universal basic income. And I think it's an idea whose time has definitely come. We'll get into some of the meat and potatoes as to why I don't think we're quite ready for it yet, but it's definitely a conversation we should be having. And I got to admit, as much as I don't like some of the other policies that he had kind of lined up, some of the things he wanted to do, he did kind of start this conversation that we need to be thinking about. So, Michelle, why don't you tell us a little bit about universal basic income?
UBI is a government program which every adult citizen receives a set amount of money on a regular basis. The goals of a basic income system is to alleviate poverty and replace other needs.
And that kind of gets into one of the objections I had with Andrew Yang. Under Yang's program, basically every American would be provided $2,000 a month. But one of the things that didn't get much discussion was that he also wanted to cut a lot of what's left of our social safety net. So you get $2,000 a month, but if you had any sort of like food stamps or government subsidized health care or anything like that, that all goes away. $2,000 a month is nice, but I don't know anybody who can afford to see a doctor on an income of $2,000 a month without some sort of help.
Right. As you and I both know, the cost of medications alone is astronomical, and most people have to decide, do I go with medications or do I go without food?
Yeah, exactly. It basically forces people to make some really difficult choices. And hell, leaving aside the question of medication for a moment, you can't even afford health insurance on $2,000 a month, let alone, any of the co-pays, deductibles, prescription costs. Our healthcare system is basically built on nickel and diming people to death in this country. And that's maybe a conversation for another time because it's outside the scope of what we're focusing on. But again, I think it's a valid criticism of where Andrew Yang was going. I think that he had some good ideas, but I think that some of what he was proposing misses the mark because he does not know what it's like to live in poverty in this country.
And again, the world was not ready for Andrew Yang, and it's not ready for Bernie Sanders yet either, because of the fact that we still strongly believe in the two-party system and the typical Democrat or Republican, and it's just...
Yeah, I think Andrew Yang and Bernie Sanders both were too outside the mainstream to get any traction within the Democratic Party. But go on, you were telling us about universal basic income. Why don't you continue?
Basically, UBI sees the need and can be provided for like social programs, as we've been talking about, medical and everything else, and it provides a better life for the people in that particular government. That's basically what it is.
Well, I think the general idea is that you'd tax, manufacturers, you'd tax the wealthy, and you would redistribute that money to people who don't have it.
And as we all know, the rich basically find loopholes every single...
Yeah, I could point to Amazon and what they've paid in taxes. I could point to Trump, claiming that he paid $750 in taxes as, oh, look at me, I'm doing my part. There's definitely some flaws with the idea behind universal basic income, but I think these are challenges to overcome rather than reasons to not pursue the program altogether.
Now, there are a few governments that have initiated a UBI program and have done it successfully.
Yeah, one example that comes to mind is Canada's program. They did UBI in a few select cities, if I remember correctly.
That is correct. And unfortunately, due to a political change in their system, the UBI program got cut.
Which isn't entirely dissimilar from what we see here in the U.S. One party does certain things, another party comes into power and undoes those things. Here in the U.S., Republicans have been chipping away for almost 100 years now, trying to undo a lot of the social safety net programs that Franklin Delano Roosevelt put into place as part of the New Deal during the Depression. So what we're seeing play out in Canada is just kind of a smaller picture of like a larger pattern of behavior that we see play out in a lot of places. Another place that's done universal basic income to pretty good effect is Alaska. Now, the way the Alaskan program works is instead of getting like a monthly stipend, basically every citizen of the state gets a yearly payment based on oil revenues. Now, that's something that probably needs to be rethought if we're going to break our dependence on oil and other fossil fuels. You can't break away from that if you've got people depending on the money coming from it. So, it's an example of a program that's currently working, but it's not the most sustainable of models. So the general idea, and this kind of goes back into some of like our history. There's this thing called the peace dividend, which is basically the idea that, every time we get done fighting a war, there's kind of a bump in the economy as production, is still continued, and your standing army is kind of dismantled and people go back to living a peacetime life. The last example of that we really saw was after World War I. You had these soldiers come home, go back into the workforce. You still had kind of a beefed up manufacturing capacity. So that allowed people to live kind of a better quality of life. Now, this was ultimately undone by the lack of regulation and ease of credit and lack of oversight in terms of investments. I'm not going to go into what caused the Great Depression here, but that was kind of what put the kibosh on that. So we get into World War II, the economy kind of self-corrects basically because we'd ramped up manufacturing in order to arm pretty much the entire world, as well as arm ourselves, for the struggle that we were having. But when World War II ended, those soldiers came home. Some of them went back into the workforce. Some of them went to school, which kind of led to the rise of what we would think of as like the modern middle class, but we also maintained a pretty huge standing army. And so a lot of the tax revenue that we were generating basically went right back into what Eisenhower referred to as the military-industrial complex. And that hasn't really changed since the end of World War II. We still pump a lot of money into defense spending, which is one of the things that kind of hinders us from going into a universal basic income type program. I mean, it's Econ 101. If you're buying up guns, then that's less money that you have to buy butter. So yeah, the basic idea is that we would tax the rich, we would tax the manufacturing, and redistribute those funds to people who don't have it for them to provide for their basic needs, hence the basic and universal basic income. Now, there's a lot of people who would, kvetch and moan about that being socialism. Socialism is not universal basic income. Socialism is basically workers owning the means of production and having a democratic workplace. Again, that's probably a topic for a later day, so we're not going to go into that too much here. But the idea of universal basic income sounds pretty good, except, between our bloated defense budget and the lack of revenue, we really don't have a way to pay for it right now. One of the estimates that I'd seen basically said that if we were going to go with universal basic income for everybody here in the United States, it would equal or exceed our gross domestic product. So basically everything we'd be producing would have to go into, providing a universal basic income, leaving us no margin for anything else that we might want to do, even if we did things like cut the defense budget I struggle to come up with an example of anything that we spend money on that's nearly as great as our defense budget because it's such a massive outlay. But again, the general idea is even if we didn't do any of the other things that government does, we still don't have enough revenue to pay for universal basic income for everybody here in America. So maybe taking a look at more targeted programs, providing universal basic income to people below a certain income threshold, for instance. A limited program might be a better way to go. So I don't think this is one of those ones where, again, I don't really have a good answer as to what the right approach would be. I just know that we're not quite ready for it yet, but we should be having the conversation. We should maybe be preparing for it. And we're going to go into why I think that after a word from our sponsors. This week's episode is brought to you by us. We enjoy bringing this podcast to you at no cost to you, but there are costs associated with running the podcast. We've purchased a new microphone for the studio, and we're in the process of purchasing new theme music to use for the episodes themselves. So if you want to help us out with that, there's a couple of ways you can do that. One is to tell all your friends. The more listeners we have, the more ad revenue we generate. But I'd like to get away from generating ad revenue, and the way you can help us out with that is by signing up and sponsoring us on Patreon. We can be found at patreon.com/anxietymonkies, and for as little as $1 a month, you can get bonus features such as being thanked live on air, or for $3 a month, you get ad-free episodes, and at $5 a month, we give you extra bonus Patreon content. So again, that's patreon.com/anxietymonkies. If you want to help us out, we'd greatly appreciate it. And now, back to the show. Okay, and we're back. So heading into the break, I kind of hinted that I wanted to talk about some of the drivers behind the need for universal basic income. And one of the biggest drivers that I see as being why we need to start talking about and thinking about universal basic income is the rise of automation. So where we currently stand with automation is that we've gotten a lot better at machine learning, AI, and we're seeing more and more jobs get handed off to machinery, and not just hardware, but software as well. There are automated services that put together basic legal documents. There are automated programs that write sports stories, maybe not with the same depth and breadth of a human reporter, but well enough that they can give you the results of, pretty much any game you care to mention. So, that would be the software side of things. On the hardware side of things, we're seeing improved sensors, better machine learning, better devices. So one example that comes to mind, for instance, is Boston Robotics working on sensors that can detect ripe fruit and developing mechanical fingers that are delicate enough to pick, berries off of vines without damaging the fruit. So these are basic things, but there's other examples as well. I mean, every electrical substation in this country used to have a couple of people on hand specifically to handle switching functions, and those jobs started to go away back in the 90s with microprocessor-based relays, doing the heavy lifting, so that now you have a handful of people in a control center centrally operating the electrical grid for vast swaths of this country, on a regional basis.
And nowadays with COVID, even before COVID hit, but now with COVID here, we're turning to automation even more for refilling prescriptions. We're also interacting them to check in for doctor appointments and making appointments as well. And it's crazy. And we're even turning to online grocery stores for shopping as well.
Yeah, there's also self-checkout. Again, where we're at right now with the technology, we haven't replaced every job. And I don't know that we could actually get to the point where we do replace every job. There's a few fields where I think that you can't fully automate a lot of these functions. Engineering being my bailiwick comes immediately to mind. There's a lot of things that we haven't automated there. But even there, I kind of see the writing on the wall. I kind of see the trends that are coming. For instance, there's now kind of a subroutine within AutoCAD that can handle doing basic wiring checks with minimal input from a human operator. You still need that human operator to double check things and make sure that the way it works lines up properly. And I won't go into how it works because maybe that's a little too inside baseball for the average home gamer. But, it really cuts down on the amount of man hours that you need to do a wiring check if you can have the software do the work for you. If all you've got to do is spend a couple of hours making sure that everything lines up correctly, that the program's reading the drawings correctly, and not have to go through and do a point-by-point wiring check, it cuts it down from, 40 or 60 hours down to, 5 or 10 at most. So, the technology is definitely advancing to a point where this is starting to become an issue. And like I said, we're not there yet, but we're heading in that direction. And unlike the Industrial Revolution, this isn't a handful of industries that are being technologied out. This is broad swaths of the economy that are looking at a reduction in jobs. And, I've seen some arguments that, this frees up people to pursue like their own business opportunities and, make things at home. But this ignores a couple of realities. First, it's expensive to start a home-based business. We definitely know a thing or two about that because we do have a little bit of a home-based side hustle doing 3D printing for people. And as cool as 3D printers are, they're still not, cheap. You can't just go down and pick up one if you don't have some sort of income, to help support that. The other thing is that, you look at American society, I think we've spoken. There's a reason why Walmart is like the leading brick and mortar retailer, because people have spoken. They don't necessarily care about quality so much as they care about getting their goods at the cheapest possible price. So, one of the things that automation can do is manufacture goods at a price that people just can't compete with. Machines don't necessarily need health insurance. They don't need paid time off. They don't need any of the quote unquote fringe benefits that we see as being kind of a necessity, for humans. So.
But I challenge it. I challenge what you said.
Okay.
Because of the fact that machines need to be repaired. Machines have upkeep. Machines require extra attention.
Sure, but they don't require it to the extent that humans do.
But would you end up having to pay more for upkeep and everything else for when the machines do?
No, and this is borne out by the evidence. This is borne out by the fact that, we're seeing manufacturing come back to the United States because one of the things that we do better than some of our competitors is quality. But, that's manufacturing coming back to the U.S., but it's not resulting in an uptick in jobs because most of this work is being done in automated facilities where you can really cut down your workforce. Yeah, you still need, a handful of maintenance people and technicians and programmers to make sure that everything keeps running, but you don't need as many people to do the actual work. So, it results in a net decrease in cost for overhead.
But also not to mention that when a machine does break down, you have a loss of work or production.
Sure. But there's redundancies. There's ways to get around that. In some of the manufacturing work that I've done, for instance, you don't have just one line capable of manufacturing. You've got multiple lines so that you can take a line down for routine maintenance, or you can cope with, having an emergency issue where you've got to go in and fix things. You're not stuck depending on just one line. So what we're seeing is a reduction in the numbers of employed people as opposed to, completely wiping them out altogether. But if things continue the way they're going, those reductions are only going to continue. I don't see any sort of situation in which they get better. I think it's just going to continue to get worse as we get better at automating things. And I think on that note, folks, we're going to take another quick break. We'll be back in just a moment. Today's episode is brought to you by Pages Printed Plastics. You can visit us at pagesprintedplastics.com. That's PAIGES printedplastics.com. We have a couple of different printers. We can do design as well as print. We can print anything from small figures like D&D miniatures to larger objects like computer parts, toys, props, pretty much anything you can imagine. So feel free to check us out. Again, that's pagesprintedplastics.com. And we're back. So going into the break, we were kind of looking at automation as being one of the drivers for the implementation of universal basic income. I kind of want to take a look at a couple of different things besides that. One of the things is that what do you do with a mass of unemployed people? One of the arguments that gets trotted out whenever people start talking about implementing welfare programs or anything like that is that it incentivizes people to not go out and look for work, or it incentivizes them to engage in behaviors that some of these more prudish politicians don't approve of. And, I cannot emphasize this enough. First of all, so fucking what? If we've got a society that's working to provide for people's needs, and, not everybody has to have, a 9-to-5 job or what have you. So what if they stay home and play video games all day, or, stay home and smoke marijuana, or whatever it is that they think these people are doing? It's nobody's fucking business. I think there's kind of a tendency, at least here in the U.S., to stick our noses where it fucking does not belong and make judgments about other people. And frankly, I find that kind of behavior pretty repellent.
It is repellent that people tend to stick their nose into everybody else's business. And yet, there are those people that are honestly trying to find a job because they have a family to support. They have pets. They have other things that require them to have a job, but just can't find a job.
Right. And I would also go so far as to say that, there's plenty of people engaged in work that doesn't need to be done. There's a lot of jobs out there that we could probably do without, not just in terms of replacing them with automation, but in just not fucking doing them. A lot of these multi-level marketing type things comes to mind. Some of the stuff that gets bought and sold in this country is mostly just to enrich a handful of people, and it doesn't really do society much of any good. But again, I suppose that's kind of besides the point, maybe a little bit more than we really want to get into today, perhaps. One of the other things that we've got going on in this country is this, we talk about this puritanical work ethic that we have as if it's a good thing, as if, our purpose is to work 60 hours a week doing something that we don't necessarily want to be doing just because we've got to put food on the table or what have you. I would go so far as to say that if we can automate jobs, we should automate jobs. We ought to be looking at work as something to maybe phase out altogether if we can. I think it would be better to let people just kind of live their lives doing things that they want to do because they want to do them, and not because, well, it's either this or fucking starve.
So we're sort of looking at the Star Trek method of living.
Well, yeah, Star Trek comes to mind as one example, but, the thing that always kind of pissed me off about Star Trek is that it's very hand-wavy in that, we have a society without money, and we have a society where, people can get on a starship and go explore space without having to worry about, providing for their families and everything. We've got all these great things with no conversation about how do we actually get there. It's just, here it is, and it's all good, and there's no consideration. One of my friends basically brought up kind of an interesting point, the idea that in order for a society like that to exist, there would have to be some sort of benevolent dictator basically driving everything to make that happen. Another way to look at it is that this is a question that's already been kind of explored. Bill Bryson's book, A Brief History of Nearly Everything, for instance, it's meant to be kind of a book about science and scientists and how some of the discoveries that we've made had been made. And one of the themes that seems to crop up again and again in that book is that a lot of these discoveries were made by the idle rich in Great Britain. You had this moneyed class, of people who come from wealth, whose families' holdings, well, they're basically built on exploitation. And again, topic for a future episode perhaps, maybe not something to go into here today, but the upshot of it is, you've got enough money that you don't need to have quote unquote meaningful work. So they started looking at the world around them, and some of these folks had a facility for figuring out how things work and made some pretty foundational discoveries that explain how our world works. There's other people who, got into the arts for the fun of it. They were doing the work that they were doing because they found it interesting and it was something they just wanted to do.
I'm going to touch on your argument about the dictatorship for the Star Trek method, and I'm going to say, is it possible that there was an uprise, that enough people got tired of the way life was, which would be our current way of living, and decided that maybe the method that Star Trek used was correct, and they uprose?
Well, there was one episode, I think it was DS9, where that was basically strongly hinted at, that people were tired of being placed in like modern ghettos, and started a series of uprisings that helped lead to, the modern Star Trek way of doing things. But again, I think a lot of that's speculative, and I don't think it's necessarily really germane to the conversation we're having. It's maybe interesting, but, we'd have to kind of put ourselves into the heads of the writers of Star Trek and really speculate about things that they never came out and said. So I don't think we can really answer that question in any meaningful way.
Possibility of another episode.
Yeah, possibly. Might be something to explore in the future. But I think we're going to go ahead and wrap it up here. I guess what I want to say in summation is that I'm not an economist, but I've taken enough econ classes that I know a thing or two about a thing or two. And I think, in summation, universal basic income is necessary if we're going to keep capitalism going. We could get into a deeper conversation about the velocity of money and things like that. But one of the ways that I kind of look at our system is I tend to think of money as being kind of like blood in a human body. In the human body, blood carries oxygen and nutrients to cells so that the cells can do what they do. And in our society, money is basically what carries goods and services from person to person. Much like the human body, if you've got blood pooling in a specific region of the body, that's not healthy. And, it leads to sickness, it leads to dysfunction, and it can even lead to the death of the body. Kind of the same thing with the society. If you've got money pooling in the hands of a select few, the rest of the people in that society are going to suffer. So universal basic income would be a solution to ensuring that, because that's how an economy works. It's the flow of money that matters. It's not, oh, hey, here's a few billionaires and soon trillionaires who are doing really well for themselves at the detriment of everybody else. It's how the society itself functions. And, that might be one of my grievances with economics as a field is that, I've heard a bunch of economists and people who follow economics say, well, a lot of what you're talking about is outside the purview of economists. And I don't think that's necessarily a valid argument. I think that's kind of a cop-out. As an electrical engineer, I don't get to say, well, this is just how the electrons flow. And if you got shocked, well, it sucks to be you. I have to consider safety in the work that I do. I have to consider the bigger picture. I have to consider, does this benefit society as a whole? And I think a lot of economists get away with not looking at that sort of thing. So, looking at the flow of money in our society, is this working for the people as a whole? Is this benefiting society? And the way I see money pooling kind of tells me that that's not the case. And I think that universal basic income would be a way to keep capitalism going. But I also have to look at capitalism as a whole and ask myself, is that really the best we can do? And before we go, Michelle did kind of want to talk about the impeachment. So why don't you tell me what's on your mind?
Well, today, Saturday the 13th of 2021, and the Senate is doing its job somewhat, and they took a vote to call witnesses for the Donald Trump impeachment trial, which was a complete surprise to everybody.
Well, I don't know that I'd say I was surprised. I think that amongst a lot of the Democratic senators, I'd been seeing talk of them wanting to have witnesses, as kind of another nail in the coffin, if you will. But the vote went pretty much the way I expected it to. It's pretty much a party line vote with a handful of Republican senators breaking rank and deciding that they want witnesses. One of the things that I did find kind of surprising was that Lindsey Graham initially voted no on witnesses, but then changed his vote. And I'm not sure I understand his thinking on this, because the votes had been counted, and once they had announced that they had enough votes to go ahead and call witnesses, he went ahead and changed his vote. I don't see why. I don't think it's like he suddenly discovered, oh, hey, I brought my spine to work with me after all. Let me go ahead and change my vote and do the right thing.
I mean, there's got to be some sort of benefit to the Republicans for them to do it, because I think that would be the only way that Lindsey Graham would have changed his vote.
Yeah, but I think he could have gotten away with voting no and keeping his vote at no, and it wouldn't have impacted his seat at all. I think a lot of these Republicans, we were talking earlier about it being their job to focus on the evidence of the case. And, one of the things that I find kind of infuriating about Republicans is that these last few years, they'd been saying shit like, well, facts don't care about your feelings, as if they had cornered the market on facts and evidence, and everybody else was just going off of opinion based on their emotional reactions. And we're seeing that these guys don't give a fuck about the facts either. We all know how the impeachment's going to play out. They can call every witness on earth, and they're not going to get the 17 Republican votes that they need to impeach the motherfucker already. So, we've also seen this kind of play out with how these guys are conducting themselves while in the hearings, doodling, playing with their phones. There's a few taking notes, but there's a lot of people who are clearly checked out from the proceedings, I think, because they know how it's going to play out.
And they've already decided that they're not going to cooperate.
Well, I don't even think it's a matter of cooperation. I think it's a matter of principle, and they've decided that their seats are safe, or that their seats would be in jeopardy if they voted to impeach Trump. So they're going to do what's best for them to the detriment of the rest of us. And it's not like they're going to impeach Trump and things are going to get better for us, but there's kind of a concept of, if this is the system we're going to have, then the idea is that nobody is above the law. And unfortunately, this is the only way to make Donald Trump face consequences for inciting an insurrection. And they've decided that they're not even going to do that. So, well, I think that's going to do it for us this week. You can find us on most of the major podcast markets. And if you'd review us and give us a 5-star rating, that'll help other people find us. We're on Twitter at Anxietymonkies, Facebook at facebook.com/anxietymonkeys. And you can email us at anxietymonkeys@gmail.com. We're also on Twitch, and I will be there tomorrow, Sunday morning at 10 a.m. Central, finishing the Adventures of Lolo 2 for the NES. And finally, if you've got a couple of bucks you want to throw our way, you can do that at patreon.com/anxietymonkeys or go in for a one-time donation at paypal.me/anxietymonkeys.
Also, thank you to Joel again for making our music. We greatly appreciate it.
Yep, our theme music was composed by Joel Gerhardsen, and we will have a link to his webpage in the show notes. Until next week, she's Michelle, I'm Rob, and we're your Anxiety Monkeys.